Hello, and welcome back to the Belonging Network Summit. Our next guest is a friend, mentor, and an incredible catalyst for social change, Mara Keisling. As many of you know, Mara is the founder and executive director of the National Center for Transgender Equality. Since 2003, she has led organizational and coalition efforts that have won significant advances in transgender equality. As one of the nation's leading voices for transgender equality, Mara is regularly quoted in major media outlets. A proud Pennsylvanian, Mara received her bachelor's degree from Pennsylvania State University and did graduate work in American government at Harvard University. So when we're thinking about the summit's main theme, today is focused on the role of allies, accomplices, and co-conspirators in the workplace. I immediately thought of Mara and her incredible leadership for building strong and meaningful relationships with allies of transgender equality in Washington, D.C. and beyond. So with her leadership, her organization has been a force for equity and justice for transgender people since arriving in our nation's capital in the early aughts. So given her vast knowledge of what it takes to win over hearts and minds, I wanted to get an exclusive interview with her where we can further discuss the critical ingredient to belonging at work. So without further ado, Mara, welcome to the summit. I am super, super excited to have you here.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here and very thankful, Rhodes.
Yeah. So let's do the thing. Okay, so we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to do some framing for the audience. So before we get too far ahead of ourselves in the conversation, I wanted to get your take on these terms, allies, accomplices, and co-conspirators. So sometimes people use them interchangeably. I know that you are within social justice circles and coalitions in Washington, D.C. Most of our audience members are not within those circles. So just if you can help us frame, what we're talking about, and how you're using these terms throughout the conversation, I think that will just help kick us off and jump into the content. So just your take on those terms.
Absolutely. Well, so I am not a theorist, right? I'm a public policy nerd and a get things done kind of activist. And so I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the exact meaning of words, and I don't spend time fussing about it and calling people out for using the wrong words. I always say that the most important thing you need to know about trans people is the golden rule. Trans people should be treated like you would want to be treated. And if you're doing your best, if you're an ally instead of an accomplice, I don't think it matters. I know that's the point of the day is that, but I would just say all of those things mean you're doing your best to support everybody, to be equitable, to be fair, to be inclusive, to be diverse in a meaningful way in an equitable way. Yeah. So I don't know when I do, for instance, anti-racism work, if I'm being an accomplice or an ally. I try to do the best I can in the most rational, reasonable way I can, in the most supportive way I can. And I try to be all those things.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I think that's really helpful. And it also contextualizes, the work that you're doing in DC, the work that your organization is doing across the country, that there's so much to be done, that really kind of focusing, okay, there's folks that want to kind of work alongside and kind of take your lead. And that's a gift in and of itself. So I think that's kind of what I'm hearing you say as like maybe a takeaway here. But I wanted to kind of focus in a little bit more around your own superpower. So, and I'm fairly confident that this is going to shine throughout the interview here. But one of your superpowers that I see is your ability to use humor to diffuse really tense conversations that sometimes center around, just trans equality and debating our humanity sometimes, and that can be challenging. And I've seen you effectively use your persuasive skills with humor, with legislators to really move them from being apathetic bystanders to champions for trans equality. So talk with me a little bit more about your use of humor and how you've effectively used it to help build allies. And even better, if you can think of like a specific example that showcases how you've done this in the past. And I can think of like one specific meeting with Barney Frank, but I'm sure there's many other examples that come to mind.
I'm not sure Barney Frank, who by the way is a very funny person, I'm not sure he would say I was a very funny person. But yeah, so first of all, it's important to understand that I come from a family with 7 kids, all of whom are actually very funny people. So I grew up with us being funny at each other, for each other, with each other. And so it's just something that's always been part of my life. So it's not so much a tactic for me as it is a lifestyle.
Yeah.
But it's actually been incredibly helpful. I think from where we sit now in 2019, people don't understand how not visible trans people were even 20 years ago, how not welcome trans people were. And what's worked a lot for me is to not go in and meet with public policymakers as another lobbyist who's going to drone on about facts and figures. We do have the facts and figures. We do have the personal stories to tell that are, heartbreaking. And those are all important tools. But one of the things I want them to see is that I'm accessible, that I'm, I think trans people are extraordinary in so many ways, but in so many other ways, we're just pretty ordinary people. And one of the things that I have is my sense of humor. Yeah. So a really good example of that is in 2012, and I know it was in January of 2012, I got called to the White House with 2 other executive directors of LGBT groups, 3. And we were basically, what was going on, in my opinion, is that this senior official in the White House, who was not the president, by the way, I don't mean that. I'm not being coy when I say a senior official, but just a senior official in the White House is talking through, they're trying to win us over, hoping that we'll all support Barack Obama's reelection. And we went with a list of things we needed them to do, real specific policy things. And then at the end of this person said, well, none of those are surprises. None of those are really very hard. What else do you got? And I made a decision to say, well, there is the, what's it called? The Holy Grail. There is the Holy Grail of LGBT activism. And I could just see the other executive directors go like, oh my God, what's Mara going to say? And this person said, well, President Obama is not there for marriage yet, but he's trying hard to get there. And I was like, no, not marriage. And everybody just sort of like stopped and stared at me. And I said, we need free ponies for all bisexuals. Now, that's stupid, right? It's silly. And afterwards, people were like, I cannot believe you said that to this such a prominent person.
Right.
But every time I saw this person afterwards, they remembered who I was.
Right.
And that we were able to leverage for trans people. Yeah. This person knew that I wasn't afraid of her because she was a big, important White House person. This person knew that I was going to be honest with her. I don't think that was being honest, actually, because clearly we didn't want free ponies for all bisexuals. But it was just a silly throwaway line that most people wouldn't feel comfortable using in a business situation. But that kind of things worked really pretty well for me to disarm people, to make myself memorable, and to make my cause memorable.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, seeing you do that in meetings on the Hill and elsewhere, people feel comfortable when you're in the room. And I think that, just kind of with storytelling, it's instant connection, cracking a joke and people are laughing with you, it is in those meetings where they can feel tense, right? It's very helpful. So I think that's a good way of bringing people in, especially as we're talking about this topic of allies. And I wanted to go to something that was featured in your bio, which is that you note with your leadership and in the involvement of your organization, NCTE, you were able to win significant advances for trans equality at the federal level, which includes getting gender identity added to federal legislation starting in 2007. So You had mentioned earlier that 20 years ago, trans folks weren't as visible. So in 2007, can you share with us a little bit more of what was happening inside the LGBTQ movement and how allies in particular were instrumental in kind of working alongside with you in making that victory possible?
Yeah, absolutely. So the LGBT movement started out as an LGBT movement, but it really became a gay rights movement pretty quickly in the early 70s, and explicitly in the early 70s. There was a decision made that the best way to move forward for everybody, actually, a decision was made by certain people and not certain other people. That's important to understand. But the people who seemed to control everything made a decision that assimilating into society would be the fastest way to advance gay rights. So they didn't want representation in the movement from people who didn't look like typical people. I even hate saying those words that way, but we all know what I mean. They wanted people who were safe and comfortable for most American to look at and say, oh, that's, could be my family kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Which means they cut out all of the trans people, the leather daddies, the super queer looking people. They just wanted people who really looked like they were typical business gays. Mm-hmm. And that's great. There's a huge part of the community that is that sort of typical appearing and acting person. I'm probably not saying all that right, but trans people were sort of cut out, and most of the 80s and 90s were spent fighting back in. When I started NCT in 2003, we definitely were not in yet. We were not in any federal legislation. Even the federal legislation that included sexual orientation didn't include gender identity. So we had to advocate for that. And we took a real inside approach. There were people taking the outside approach, which made the inside approach possible, by the way. I've never been one to, sometimes we're inside, sometimes we're outside, but we're primarily inside players. But we really rely on there being an outside game with people protesting, with people demanding, with people, and then we're able to smooth on the way inside and get some things done. Mm-hmm. And that's what we did. And we started winning over more and more people. A really important date, and I don't know the exact date, but it was in April of 2005. We finally, after about 3 or 4 years, got a meeting scheduled in Senator Kennedy's office. Now, he was a real champion of all marginalized people. And I think if he were alive today, he would be a real champion of trans people. But at the time, there were a lot of political and social questions that had him sort of more aligned with the gay part of the LGBT movement and not the trans part. He was not hostile to us at all, but we couldn't meet with him. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that finally broke through was Lisa Weiner-Mafus from the National Organization for Women, NOW, asked for a meeting with Senator Kennedy, Senator Kennedy's office, and asked if she could bring friends. And I think she brought 23 people from 23 different organizations, and they were all carrying a letter from another 20 or 30 organizations saying, hey, you really need to include transgender people in the what became the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. That wouldn't have happened without coalition, without allies or co-conspirators or whatever they were called at the time. I mean, there definitely was some co-conspiratorizing, some incredible allyship, and it really paid off. And then finally, one of the most important things that happened in 2007 was that to make a little advance politically or to make a little advance legislatively, the legislators who were in charge of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act had agreed to put trans people in, and then 7 months later, for just to move forward a little tiny smidgen legislatively, took us back out. And honestly, I don't know what would have happened. I don't know if our position would have been different if there was a chance it could become law, but there was no chance it could become law in 2007. It wasn't going to pass the Senate, and George W. Bush definitely was not going to sign it, and had announced publicly he wasn't going to sign it. So it didn't make any sense it shouldn't have made any sense to anybody to screw with the solidarity in the community in order to make a little legislative advance. So we all pushed back, and then it turned out there were over 300 organizations in the LGBT movement that stood up with us in that instance, against the biggest, but one organization that didn't. And that was a real pivot point. And interestingly, the whole time we were having that fight, the leaders of us who were really running the campaign kept saying, remember, we're not playing for this year. We're not going to win this. We're going to win everything. We're going to win big. And if we do this right, they will never again try to do this. And that's how it's played out. Absolutely. They managed to pass the bill in the House, and then it died in the Senate. And nobody has ever tried to take us out again. And I don't think they would or could.
Yeah. I mean, that strategy, it was being in DC at that time, it was hard, right? It was hard to be there and hard to kind of do that internal work inside of the Rainbow family, for better or worse, working through some, real education and making sure that we could be better allies to each other within the movement. And you all played that well, because it's true. It's true. I mean, moving forward, there's still work to be done inside of our communities. And I feel that we're stronger from something that was so painful at that time.
Can I say one more thing about that,
sure.
Rose? It's really important. So one of the things I said that I think would be very controversial in trans circles is that if there was a chance that ENDA could have become law without us, I think we would have had an obligation to at least think about that. To at least think about whether or not, if our analysis was that it could pass into law with just sexual orientation, but not if it included gender identity, we would have had to calculate differently. We may have come to the same conclusion. I think a lot of trans people would have come to the same conclusion, but when we're demanding coalition, we have to be good coalition partners. You have to be a friend to have a friend.
Right.
And we can't just say, screw you, people who are trying to pass sexual orientation. It's everything or nothing. The truth was, our real choice was nothing or nothing.
Yeah.
And from nothing or nothing, the only gain to be made for anybody was either a little tiny legislative blurb forward, or redefining or solidifying the new definition of what the community was. Right. And so we felt tremendously righteous there, because there was no circumstance that year that this bill was going to pass into law. Right. So why do that to anybody?
Yeah. Yeah. And so just for those in the audience kind of not immersed in law and policy at this point, the United States still at the national level lacks federal protections for LGBT folks across the spectrum in the workplace, amongst other areas of life. And so I wanted to go to this next question, Mara. In 2009, you co-authored the groundbreaking report, Injustice at Every Turn, and the subsequent report in 2015, the U.S. Transgender Survey. These reports are some of the few that have actually connected with tens of thousands of transgender and non-binary folks on all aspects of our lives. So there's a really robust section on the experiences of trans people in the workplace. And for those within our audience that don't know much about trans people's workplace experiences, what are a few things that you learned from writing these reports that you believe workplace champions ought to know to create more inclusive organizations, but probably don't at this point?
Well, first, before I talk specifically about business, something that's true throughout all aspects of society, all of which tend to marginalize trans and non-binary people. But something that I think is very important for people who do look at it from a business lens to think about is we saw that trans people in general were very marginalized. But when you're also marginalized because of something else, it's a multiplier in really big ways. So if you're facing transphobia and racism, that's a lot worse for you than just facing transphobia.
Yeah.
If you're facing transphobia and disability access challenges or disrespect, that's a lot harder than just facing transphobia. So when folks are thinking about the trans folks in their workplace, they ought to think about the trans folks as being more than just a trans person. That's from this marginalization point of view that we saw in the survey in particular. But also where that comes to is a lot of trans people will tell you they're thought of as the trans person. And I mean, I still feel this way, even as now a movement elder in the LGBT movement. When I speak at big meetings, everybody assumes I'm speaking as a trans person about trans things. But I actually am more than that. I am also lesbian identified. I'm non-binary identified. I'm, I have points of view about other things. And I believe that my experience and my abilities can be useful to the movement beyond just the trans stuff.
Absolutely.
So I think it's important in business to, when people are advocating for whether it's disability rights or anti-racism or women's pay equity or whatever they're advocating for, that doesn't mean that's all they are.
Right.
And folks should take that into account. So that's a thing. The issues that are important are so broad. It's every aspect of work, right? It's little things that most people don't even think about, like what's written on your ID badge, if you're a workplace that has ID badges. But do you require a legal name on it? And if so, why? And that sounds like a little thing to most people, but for some trans people, that can out them, and that can damage their career or end their career.
Yes.
So little things like that, but then huge things like access to facilities, like participation in social gatherings, whether it be like the company softball team. I got a question several times from folks who were like, we have a softball team and we're required to have 3 women on the field at all time, and we don't know what to do with trans people. Well, just ask the trans person. And by the way, what does that rule mean? And why do you have that rule? And is that the right rule to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish?
Yes.
How do you do forms, right? We get a lot of questions about how do we do, we have this form that we collect this data. How do we ask questions about whether you're trans? Well, first of all, make sure you really need to know that information.
Yes.
Driver's licenses and other kinds of IDs always have sex markers on, or often have sex markers on them. And there's no reason for that. They just do because they always have. And there is, in some ways, there may not seem like there's any harm, but the truth is, for some people, that creates an unnecessary obstacle, an unnecessary bit of disrespect that that is happening just because you always did it that way.
Yeah.
I was talking to a 13-year-old who, when he was 12, was suicidal and was hospitalized. And he identified as a trans man, a transmasculine person. But the hospital kept saying he was a girl. And one of the things and that's not that unusual actually, and it's changing and we're all working to change that. But one of the things that really surprised me was they separated, in this particular hospital, they separated the boys and the girls for snack time. And he told me, and they made me have snacks with the girls and not the boys. And I'm thinking to myself, why in the world do they separate, kids, like children? And so this isn't even like 18-year-olds, not that they should do with 18-year-olds, but I mean, this is like a 12-year-old, and they're making the girls and the boys have separate snacks. And, why do they do that?
Right.
and it means when you have social events at work, more informal social events where you're saying all the women can come, or, this is just the guys this time, that can have really negative impacts. And, so I would say think through that. And then one thing that, the benefits are important question.
Yeah.
I'm not a benefits expert, but make sure if you're providing healthcare to your people, make sure you're providing all the healthcare that people really need.
Yeah.
And then last big topic that I think is often overlooked, so I'll just throw it in there, is privacy.
Yeah.
Just as you wouldn't, when you introduce somebody and say, well, Rhodes, this is your new coworker, Nancy. And by the way, Nancy's transgender.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to do that. And that's a privacy violation. Just as if you had said, and that's Nancy, her husband has a gambling problem.
Yeah.
Or I don't mean to equate the two, but just don't gossip about people. Don't share information about people that they should either share or keep to themselves according to their own wishes.
Yeah, I think that's great advice of just kind of remembering that our stories are ours to share, right? And that covers everything from our gender history to childhood memories that might be relevant to share in the workplace or not. So I think that's really, really good advice. Kind of building off of this, right? It's like one of the biggest challenges that I see when it comes to building more inclusive workplaces for trans folks and non-binary folks is like organizations seem to struggle with what to do next after they've done some of these bigger kind of policy or system changes, like some of the things that you've talked about. So everything from having a non-discrimination policy to creating all user restroom facilities, or adopting an HR policy around managing gender transition in the workplace, right? So say an organization accomplishes these things. For the champions that are on this call, and many of them are in workplaces that have already done a lot of this work, what might be some additional things that anybody in the workplace can do that could communicate that they are champions for trans inclusion? So kind of small everyday action. So no matter where you are within the organization.
Yeah. Well, so as somebody who runs an organization, let me talk about something from personal experience. So one of the things we've had to do a lot of work on here in the last 5, 10, 15 years since we started was we had to do a lot of anti-racism work. We're part of a system, and all of us were raised in a particular system that has some real flaws to it that need to be fixed. And so some of the things are really obvious. And when somebody points them out, you can say, well, we can't do that anymore, or, oh, we have to do this better. Some of them aren't obvious, and some of them evolve. And so one of the things I'm really proud of here is that not only have we made some changes that felt obvious, not only are we still making changes, because some changes you can't just make, right away. You have to work through them and research them and implement them. But we've also set up a system to identify new things. And I think when you're talking about equity in the workplace and diversity in the workplace, we're never done. We're never done. And so having systems in place, having a way of thinking in place, and a culture in place that say, we're not perfect. We want to be as perfect as we can be. But it's not a destination, it's a journey. And getting comfortable with not being finished, and trying to get finished. I'm not saying, so lay back because you're never going to succeed, so don't bother doing anything. I'm not saying that at all, but having a system in place to allow for input, to allow for conversation and learning, I think is a super great thing. And then, let me make a pitch to trans folks in the workplace too. While it is true that there have been trans people and non-binary people, gender non-conforming people, as long as there have been people, it is also true that trans people in the workplace is a very new phenomenon. And non-binary people in the workplace is a very new phenomenon. And we we are therefore, in a way, demanding radical inclusion in the best possible sense of the word. We are saying, I know you don't know anything about this, but I'm here and I demand to be included. And we should do that. And that's how we've moved far. But we need to radically accept and radically include the people who aren't quite there yet.
Yeah.
Our job is not to look for problems and condemn them. Our job is to look for problems and fix them.
Yeah.
Our job is to win people over. And when they've been won over, we embrace them. And you know what? If they screw up, then we work with them and then we embrace them. Yeah. I know I'm not perfect and I know nobody else is perfect, but boy, if I can change people a little bit, and if I can keep getting better myself all the time, that's pretty spectacular.
So that your response on that totally feeds into this next question, which is, considering the workplace champions that are ready to take some of the actions that you've shared, some of the kind of more everyday actions, what advice do you have for them to kind of bring along more folks that still may need some more education? They still need to build relationships with trans people. How do you encourage them to start doing that work inside of their organizations?
I'm a big believer in communications, and I don't mean that just simply listen to people and talk to people. That's an important, super important part of it. But there are other things to do, like I know you are inside of a lot of companies all the time, talking to people. They bring you in to speak, to do training, or just to be there sometimes. Mm-hmm. I do that too. A company will just call up and say, June is such a busy month because everybody wants to have some trans or LGBT thing during June. But, all year round, you can do that. I can't tell you how many times I've been inside of a workplace just doing a Trans 101 or basically a stand-up comedy act, which is sometimes what my stuff feels like. And somebody will come up to me and say, thank you very much. I have a trans child. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I'm struggling with coming out. And I didn't think I'd be welcome, but they brought you here, so maybe they're trying. And just having people come in and speak, having book clubs, having working groups, and having support groups. I don't think they're called support groups, but not just ERGs, but having discussion groups where, not just trans people. This is also true of people of color or older workers or people with disabilities, where folks can get together and get some solidarity and get some fellowship and get some oomph behind what they see as some of the issues that have to be fixed. Yeah. So all of those are communication structures that if they're in place, I think they can go a long way.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. On the other end of the spectrum, right? So when you're the majority of folks in the workplace are, kind of either like champions or, the majority are kind of somewhere in the middle. But for those folks who are more recalcitrant, they're likely to dig in their heels around any kind of change. When it comes to including trans folks, they may recoil and have a reaction. What strategies would you share with the audience around just how do you neutralize some of the squeaky wheels where they're not the majority, but they can get loud and they can strike fear and maybe slow down some of the progress that people are trying to accomplish?
It depends whether they're well-meaning or not. Mm-hmm. Are they coming from a place of ignorance, or are they coming from a place of ignorance and hate? Yeah. Are they violating some of the sort of the most important general rules of any society? I don't mean the big society. I mean a little society within a workplace. You have to let your coworkers be your coworkers. Mm-hmm. And when you and I were starting at this, we'd go into companies all the time, and people would say, "Well, what happens if somebody just doesn't want to work with a trans person?" Mm-hmm. And we'd say, well, what happens if they don't want to work with a woman, or they don't want to work with a person with disabilities? And they'd say, well, this is different. And now over 20 years, people have started to understand it isn't different.
Yes.
I mean, it is different, but it's not different. You know, we don't get to pick who our coworkers are. We don't get to pick who our supervisor is. And we don't get to disrespect any of our coworkers because of who they are.
Right.
And so if somebody is doing that, that's a violation of a much bigger rule than diversity is important or we want to welcome trans people. That's a violation of the whole undergirding of how people work and live together. And sometimes people have to be told, you can't do that.
Right.
One of the most beautiful things I ever saw at a corporation, I don't want to say which one it was, because there's two, they're close together, and I can't remember whether it was this one or that one, so I don't want to disrespect this person. But this trans person came out, and this was about 1999. So this is when business leaders really weren't on board. So this is a big company that people know about, and a subsidiary of it. And this person came out, and then there was this, like a couple weeks later, and the person was not doing well. They were not being accepted very well.
Right.
And then there was this all company-wide meeting that was, everybody was in, there were a lot of people in person, and there were videos, and the CEO came on and did his little spiel. And then at the end, he said, by the way, can I just say one more thing? I just want to do a quick call out to our colleague in whatever city she was in, Susan, who has recently transitioned from male to female. This is, you know, old, this is 20 years ago, so it's old language sometimes, but it's like, you know, she's transgender, she's transitioned. And I want to thank her for being brave, but more importantly, I want to thank all of her coworkers and the whole company for understanding how important it is to welcome her, to support her, and to always do that to all of our coworkers. And it was so brilliant, because in a time where that was a pretty high risk position for that person to take. But what he was saying was, hey, all of you, knock it off.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
The CEO is on board, get on board. And he did it in such a soft way, but the outliers knew they were outliers.
Yeah. Yeah. Just that power of setting the tone and kind of recognizing your area of influence. Certainly the CEO, I mean, if you're at the top of the organization, your words truly, truly do matter. So just that, and it's a warning, right? But it's not necessarily backed with a policy change or a systems change, but just kind of shifting the dialogue. Brilliant
use of soft power.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that example. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
That,
you want me to tell you what it was?
Yeah. Well, if you can share. Yeah.
Well, I want to think about, I'm not sure. I'm jumbling it up here so that it'll be hard for you to edit it in, but it was Disney animation.
Oh, whoa. Okay. Very cool.
It wasn't Disney, it was Disney Animation. So it was a smaller company than like Disney. And now Disney has gobbled up, you know, half the universe.
Yes.
So Disney's a much huger company now than it was 20 years ago. But
yeah. Wow. That's amazing. I thank you for that story. I think that's stories always help us, especially kind of looking at examples of businesses that are doing really well. And so kind of when I think of who you are someone who is eternally optimistic, especially when it comes to trans equity and justice. So kind of in the spirit of empowerment, thinking about the organizations that you've worked with, and kind of a number of well-known businesses that have taken up the charge to demonstrate their commitment to trans communities in the workplace. Can you share with us maybe one additional example to Disney Animation that is a company that maybe you're working with right now that just has gone above and beyond to demonstrate commitment to our communities in a way of kind of using that soft leadership, setting the tone, and backing it up with some significant changes, whether they're policy, system, everyday practices, whatever it might be. just to inspire those folks in the audience of like, okay, there's an example there, Disney animation, maybe one other, just to keep encouraging people to continue doing this work.
Sure. Well, it's really easy. A company we've been working with a lot over the last couple of years is Lush Cosmetics.
Yeah.
And Lush has been a phenomenal partner in a lot of ways. They did this amazing educational campaign in February of 2018, where they actually took all their products out of the windows of their stores and put in trans positive messaging, and trans rights is human rights said all over their stores. And they took snippets of people's stories and snippets from our survey and put them next to all of the products in the store. So when you're shopping for a bath bomb, you'd see, the unemployment rate for trans people is 3 times the national average in the US. And they did a book on how to be a good trans ally and made like a zillion copies of them and put them in all of their stores, trained all like 700,000 or 8,000 people on how to train customers on being good trans allies. I mean, it was just phenomenal support. But to answer your question, why it was such a great thing for trans people in that workplace is they do these ethical campaigns a couple times a year, I think, at Lush. They just did one on why it's important not to be massacring sharks. They've done one on accepting refugees into the United States and Canada. It's actually a Canadian company. But they've just done these ethical campaigns all the time. The trans ethical campaign, I'm pretty sure, was the first one they did because the employees asked for it. Mm-hmm. So they have other ways of figuring out which ones there are. But this one, they had so many trans and non-binary folks in their stores. That's what the folks wanted to see. So the company said, well, we support our trans employees, so that's what we're going to do. And they featured a lot of their trans employees in videos and on blog posts and stuff. And I'll tell you, I challenge you, go into a Lush store anywhere in North America and say, do you like working for Lush? And watch the answers. And I've done this. I've now actually been in 32 Lush stores. I go in whenever I run across one, which are a little easier to identify than other stores because you can smell them from like two or three stores away. So when you're walking down the street, you're like, I smell a Lush. And
it's a really distinct smell. Yeah,
it's a very distinct floral smell from their bath bombs and their other products. And so I've gone in, and one of the questions I often ask is, how do you like working at Lush? And people love working at Lush.
Yeah.
And they did things like, as I recall, they didn't used to allow bling, people to wear, because it's there has to be a cohesive marketing look. And they didn't allow people to wear bling. But during that campaign, they allowed people to wear pronoun buttons, and in fact created pronoun buttons.
Very cool.
And I now notice a lot of their people still wear the pronoun buttons.
Yeah.
So they must have allowed that. And, that doesn't seem like a big thing to probably most people. But to the people who it matters to, it matters a lot. And it matters a lot that corporate is saying, we see you, we honor you, we will fight for you. Mm-hmm. Not just Lush, but all of the companies now that are standing up for trans rights, that are standing up for LGBT rights, that's really noticed by the employees.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I would just say Lush is one good example of that that's currently on my mind.
Yeah. And for our participants, we'll include that campaign in our supplemental materials. But I'm really happy that you mentioned that campaign. Being out here in Portland, Oregon, there's a couple of Lush stores out here, and it was so powerful, as a customer, to walk by, see the visible campaign with the posters and the staff really demonstrating their commitment to trans inclusion, but also to actually see these bath bombs that had the colors of the trans flag. And I mean, it was amazing. So
they were called Inner Truth.
I love that.
That was the product. And by the way, then they donated about $500,000. So 100% of the gross from that product went to trans causes.
That's awesome. Right. Yeah. Especially, just still trying to build a movement and getting resources to really address the broad needs of our communities is huge. So really, really great example, super powerful. So thank you for that. With our kind of second to last question, I'm curious if you have advice for folks that are maybe new to the topic of trans inclusion in the workplace, of where they can go to either start their allyship journey or continue to build their ally, accomplices, co-conspirator muscles to help us or to kind of work with us to build better workplaces so that they work for everyone.
Yeah. Well, when I was coming up in the business world, you wouldn't join an ERG that you didn't identify with personally.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't have the identity that it represented, is what I mean.
Right.
And now that's not the case, and it's so important to have allies in ERGs. So that's I think a super easy one. When I speak to ERGs, it's rarely ever just LGBT people. There are a lot of other folks, and including some senior folks who are representing. It's not just the one gay executive who comes. It'll be non-queer executives, and that really matters. So I think that's a thing. But standing up for people when they need it, and standing up to people when they need it. So when people are attacking people because they don't like them or they don't like that kind of person, really matters. And standing up to them sometimes can be soft, just hey, well, I actually think that person's incredibly brave and I'm 100% supportive of them and I'm going to eat lunch with them. But sometimes standing up, you have to do it hard, and you have to say, hey, person who's disrespecting other people, knock it off. That is just not okay. It is not okay here. So I think that's always something all of us can do, is standing up for what's right and supporting people who need us to support them.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's powerful and right to the point. So Mara, thank you again for spending a little bit of your day with us. Where is the single best place where we can find more information about your work and just to learn a little bit more about the work that NCT is doing inside workplaces, if it's online?
Yeah, it's online at transequality.org. We have resources there for companies, for individuals. And it also tells you how to get in touch with us if you need any kind of assistance that we can give you, or if you just need somebody to come and have lunch with. We're happy to support folks who are doing good work.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, and for sharing so much of your wisdom. It's always a pleasure just to spend a little bit of time talking with you, learning about some of your perspectives on how to make workplaces better. And for our participants, we'll have workbooks and other supplemental resources that complement this conversation today, and of course, information about the Lush campaign as well.
Thanks, Rhodes.
For everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget, if you want more time with these talks, if you'd like additional resources for doing this work in your organizations, and if you'd like to join our community calls after the summit, you can check out our options for getting extended access to all of the sessions and other helpful goodies using the link below. Every purchase also helps me pay the speakers for their generosity, wisdom, and labor in helping us grow the belonging movement. Thank you, and thanks again to today's featured belonging champion.